In 1611, Aemilia Lanyer did two extraordinary things. She published a book of her original poetry under her own name. Even more bold and assertive were her verses calling for the liberty of women from men's oppression.
Then let us have our liberty again, and challenge to yourselves no sovereignty. You came not into the world without our pain. Make that a bar against your cruelty. Your fault being greater, why should you disdain our being your equals, free from tyranny? If one weak woman simply did offend, this sin of yours hath no excuse, no end.
And okay. So that in itself is pretty spectacular. Now, I'd like Catherine to actually read some Shakespeare for us. Okay, thank you. This is Aemilia from Othello. Okay, thank you, Catherine.
It feels like something I'd say from my heart. But I do think it is their husbands' fault if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us. Or say they strike us or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet we have some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell and have their palates for both sweet and sour, as husbands have.
Thank you. I think there's some similarity between the historical Aemilia Lanyer, and Shakespeare's Aemilia. It raises a few questions, such as, is that a coincidence? Or are they the same feminist Aemilia? Or did Shakespeare know this woman and used her as a model? And then you get to think, well, both of them are authors. Both of them are poets. Shakespeare's a poet. Amelia's a poet. Maybe they collaborated. Maybe they're co-authors. So that's the question I'm sort of addressing in this book. Now, I'm not going to try to give you the elaborate argument that's put into this book. There's quite detailed arguments and well documented. I'll give you a bit of background about Aemilia, though. No, first off, co-authors of Shakespeare. Just 5 years ago, there was a fairly controversial work came out called the New Oxford Shakespeare Authorship Companion by major scholars and experts in computational stylistics, and they actually, I'll read it. They confirmed the presence of other writers' hands in plays that until recently were thought to be Shakespeare's solo works. It's actually admitting what had long been known, that there are other hands in the writing of Shakespeare that weren't acknowledged on the front pages of Shakespeare's works. It's always just Shakespeare, nobody else. Now, the thing is, these scholars, they suggest eight co-authors that could have been involved, and they're all men, of course. And none of them are Aemilia, of course. So, okay, maybe there's no co-author. Maybe Shakespeare worked with Aemilia, because who was the employer of Shakespeare but the Lord Chamberlain? He was in the Chamberlain's Men Theatre Company. Okay, but of course, the Chamberlain's Men. But there is a Chamberlain's woman. The 67-year-old Lord Chamberlain had a 23-year-old mistress, Aemilia Lanyer. He employed most of her relatives. They were musicians in the royal court. He was the cousin of the Queen. He was also called Lord Hunsdon. He was an important man high up in the English army. And the power and age differential is huge. I would say far worse than, let's say, Harvey Weinstein and his victims. Here we learn about the underbelly of the royal history that might be written about in your history books, because she went to her astrologer. And this astrologer was a really sleazy quack. But a lot of the society folk in London at the time went and saw him, and they revealed a lot about themselves. And she actually spoke quite candidly to him, and he documented it very precisely. And it revealed that Lord Hunsdon, he got her pregnant. Then he forced her to marry one of his employees. Great, wonderful. She had Lord Hunsdon's son, but of course the poor Alphonse Lanyer, who she married, he was cuckolded. He took care of it. And she was given a £40 annuity to keep her silent. But one thing that this guy Simon Foreman, who's the astrologer, he notes she couldn't keep a secret. She couldn't keep a secret. She could not be silenced, and that's what I hope to show tonight. She doesn't. It's not going to be silenced. I think she was livid. I think she was really angry. Okay, something about Aemilia. She was born in London. Her father was Baptiste Pisano. He was the Queen's Italian teacher. He was the Queen's lute teacher as well. He was a musician in the royal court as well. And in fact, in some of Emilia's poems, she talks about knowing the Queen, probably when she was a very young girl, because her father died when she was 7 years old. So she probably got to know the Queen when she was an infant. Her mother died when she was a teenager, and it's quite likely that that's when she became a mistress of the 60-year-old Lord Hunsdon. Now, and of course she's literate in English, Latin and Italian, quite multilingual. Now, if you think, I still haven't made the case for Aemilia knowing Shakespeare, let's look at this next slide. If you run through a lot of the plays of Shakespeare, her name keeps on coming up, whether it's a first name or a variation of her surname. Now, Aemilia is not a common name. It's certainly in Elizabethan times. In the Shakespeare canon, we have only one Juliet. In the Shakespeare canon, we only have one Portia, but we've got plenty of Emilias. She keeps on coming up. Oh, okay. And the other thing about these Emilias, for example, we'll go back to Othello, because we've just had a reading from Othello. There's another fabulous speech in Othello, in the finale, where Emilia's talking to the dying Desdemona. She's just been murdered by her husband, and she's tries singing to her while she's dying. And then Othello comes in the room, and she just launches at him with anger. It's a really emotional moment in the finale. She's got a really special spot in this whole play. Then, if we go to Two Noble Kinsmen, in the finale of Two Noble Kinsmen, she's talking to the dying Asate, who was her lover, very tenderly, and then it's another moving moment that really makes the play. So she's not just a token in these plays. Another factor about Othello, just so happens Oh, where did the name Othello come from? Well, we know that a neighbour of the Bassano family in the village of Bassano in Italy was a guy called Girolamo Otello. He was the apothecary in the village. Seems another really startling coincidence. Okay, so that's one point. Well, it's a few points there. But here's another one. Okay, somehow or other Shakespeare had access to not just one untranslated Italian work, he had a whole library of untranslated Italian works, and somehow he read them and based a lot of his plays on them. So, with Aemilia in the picture, well, her father taught the Queen Italian, so you would imagine that he'd have a little bit of a library. Furthermore, going back to Othello, you can see Othello and Measure for Measure are based on stories by Geraldo. If we go back to Two Noble Kinsmen, one of the last plays by Shakespeare, there's this really odd reference, just a one-off reference to this guy, Geraldo. And guess what? It's Geraldo, Emilia's schoolmaster. Yeah. The thing is, Geraldo not only wrote a lot of plays in Italian, he actually wrote a textbook on playwriting. So you think, whoa, she's got another book up there, in her library. That's teaching her how to write. And let's say, another interesting fact. Merchant of Venice. Okay, there's two merchants in the Merchant of Venice, if you remember. There's a guy called Antonio and there's a guy called Bassanio. Well, it just so happens that Aemilia has an uncle. The brother of Baptiste Bassano was Antonio Bassano. And guess what? He was a merchant of Venice, a London-based merchant of Venice. That's getting pretty interesting too, I think. And of course, if she didn't have a certain book, she could make an order through her uncle to get in the latest books. So it's all circumstantial. But anyway, I'll put it out there. Just before I leave this slide though, I want to acknowledge the work of a woman who couldn't make it tonight. She was wanting to come, but she's a bit too sick. She used to meet with a group of people interested in Shakespeare that we used to gather together, and she did a PhD in Italian, and she studied Dante, and she found this fabulous. She was really bewildered because in Dante's Paradiso, there's a reference to the nuns of St. Clair, and it's found in Measure for Measure. It hadn't been reported before. So I just want to make sure people. I wanted to acknowledge Vivian Robertson. She's 82 years old. She did a PhD 5 years ago, and I think great work. Okay, now I'm going to get more specific. Could all be just by coincidence, couldn't it? And it's hard to get the Academy to change their mind on Shakespeare. Okay. Now, the most popular play by Shakespeare, in his lifetime that is was Pericles. Ben Jonson was jealous and he sort of poo-pooed it, but it's because it got performed a lot, it got published a lot during Shakespeare's lifetime. Okay, so there's one point in the play where it talks about enforced marriage. At the bottom there, I'll tame you, I'll bring you to subjection, that I will make you man and wife. It's actually a parody of this other play called Miseries of Enforced Marriage. I'll yoke you still, in spite of daring to contradict my will. I'll make you marry my chambermaid. Now, it may not look obvious, but there's so many other parallels that show that the guy who wrote that first play, Miseries of Enforced Marriage, is a guy called George Wilkins, reputed to be George Wilkins, and he's thought to be the co-author of Pericles. Now, there's some problems here. That's what's understood to be the case by most scholars. Problem is that George Wilkins, the play Pericles is about, it condemns incest, it condemns enforced prostitution, it condemns forced marriage, goes up here. George Wilkins, they've delved into his background, they've found he's got a huge criminal history. Guess what? He was a pimp. He was a violent guy who beat up women, pregnant women. He eventually went on to, after these, to supposedly writing these things, to started up a brothel. Whoa, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance, I think, in that. One moment he's challenging the wickedness of these things, and then he's doing it all together. The other thing is, just as a man, writing about enforced marriage, or admitting that one, your family's failed, or two, that you could be forced into marriage, it sort of would really upset a lot of men's pride, I think. It's more likely to be an issue from a woman, because it was a big issue in Elizabethan times, and of course in a lot of other cultures now, of enforced marriage. So, now if we... I should also mention that George Wilkins, the reputed author of this play, he wrote the prose novel of Pericles that was published just before the play Pericles. So that's another strong sign that he was involved in Pericles. Okay. Now, if you look at the unspoken speech prompts in the play, they're not spoken on the stage, so it's not going to be too slanderous. You find, who's the marriage enforcer? Lord Hunsdon. Lord Hunsdon. This is, how would George Wilkins know about the secret sex life of Lord Hunsdon? He couldn't. This is fairly definitive proof that Aemilia wrote both these, was a co-author, was the author of Miseries of Enforced Marriage. She's writing an allegory of her own personal life. And this is like 15 years after she was forced into her own marriage. It's still eating at her. She's still wounded. And of course, she's a co-author with Shakespeare. She's collaborating with Shakespeare. There are many other inexplicable things in Shakespeare that I feel are revealed in my research, in my book. But I'm just going to add, I haven't been timing myself, but I'll just add one more thing. This is not in my book. What happened after when Shakespeare died? Shakespeare died in 1616. What did Aemilia do? She started up a school for gentlemen's children in 1617. It ran for about 3 years, and then it seemed to collapse for various financial reasons. But what about in the 1620s? Because Aemilia actually lived till 1645, into her 70s. She had another 30 years to live after Shakespeare died. What happened, let's say, in the 1620s? Okay. Just a little diversion. John Milton was a lover of all things Italian. And he was a poet, of course. He was probably, in many people's minds, he's second only to Shakespeare. And he wrote Italian sonnets when he was a teenager. Well, before he went to Italy, somewhere he learnt Italian while he was in London. And these sonnets, which John Milton refers to as trifles, refer to a woman with dark eyes who's multilingual and whose name honours the Reno River Valley and also the famous ford of the Rubicon. There's a translation of that in sonnet number 2. And all scholars say, well, that's her name must be Aemilia. They don't know who it is. Well, no, a couple of scholars have said, well, it could be Aemilia Lanyer. Now, at that time, in the 1620s, John Milton was a teenager. He's learning Italian. She was in her 50s. Yeah, I'll just put it out there. I think it might have been a teenage crush for a very popular woman. So, there's a picture of my book. There's a couple of plays that haven't reached Melbourne yet because of lockdown. Aemilia, the play, was a smash hit in London in 2018. I gave them a little bit of advice of my research, and they said it inspired them. And but I won't. It was an excellent production as well of theirs. And there's this Sydney crowd have come up with this. Venus and Adonis is also talking about the relationship of Shakespeare and Aemilia. So, in herself, she's amazing. But if you want to know about Shakespeare, you've got to know about her too. So I'll just leave it at that.